about the amount of flow for a base flow or a pulse flow and when that would happen and so forth.
So now the next question. If I understand the rules and regs as they're being, I don't quite understand them. So my understanding in conversations with NIMS and CDFW has been that the base flow that you're looking for is below Stanford Vina Irrigation Company Dam. Is that correct? For the 50 CFS and the 20 CFS and the pulse flow?
That is correct. The way that the water is used and the water rights are divided, the uppermost diversion is by Deer Creek Irrigation. They have about a 1/3 right to the total flow of the creek. So 2/3 of the flow must be passed beyond that point, which is typically, and I think always, adequate to pass fish between Stanford Vina and Deer Creek. But collectively, we're proposing that they meet the needs below Stanford Vina.
Next.
Thank you. In the appendices that was offered, and this is a question for staff and/or the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, there's reports that were identified on 2013 for Deer Creek Spring Run, 2014 Deer Creek. There's 3 reports that were listed. They're unpublished reports. Have those been submitted to the State Water Resources Control Board?
Yes, they have been submitted to Dan Schultz.
Okay. Have those reports been posted on the website? I haven't seen them.
No, they have not.
Okay.
They are not in report form, that is data summaries.
Okay. Other than the reports, and I don't know if you've had a chance to review the staff report prior to coming here, but other than the 3 reports for Deer Creek in 2013 and 2014 that are unpublished reports that are just raw data sets, is there anything else, any other report or document specific to Deer Creek prior to 2013 by CDFW?
I'm familiar with a couple of reports. There's the Fish and Game 1993 Central Valley Action Plan. There's the literature support, well, there's the 2007 Deer Creek Flow Enhancement Program that I'm aware of, and there's the 2009 draft NOAA Central Valley Salmon Steelhead Recovery Plan.
Thanks. Okay. Have you looked at, or your staff, and we had a discussion about this, and have you looked at, or the state board can answer this question, have you looked at projected flows in Deer Creek that you would expect to see during the time period of this proposed curtailment?
Yes, we did. We have a 50% and 90% exceedance curtailment plot that we could show.
Did you pick a particular year, though? I mean, have you looked at a particular year to ascertain, or did you just use averages of for exceedance plots? So it would be 90% would be you'd average most of them and then find out that, you know, the 10% worst, correct? And this is the worst route on record, you'd have to agree, right?
We use the projected exceedance
Okay.
For this year,
So I'd like
along with previous years.
Okay, I'd like to offer flow records. These are from the USGS gauge for Stanford Vina. This is at the mouth of the canyon. So what we tried to do is we went back and picked a year, and 1977 seems to be tracking very well with this year, unfortunately. And so what happens is that if you look at the flow numbers here and you look at what's being proposed, we're almost tracking. We're off by a day or two here and there, and we're off by CFSs here and there. But if this flow regime was to go into effect, if you looked at, so I'm going to pick a date of, here's one. So it goes June 10th, there would be 85 CFS in the creek, and that's at the canyon. That's before the 3 diversions occur. Okay, so if it's 50 CFS, that'd leave 33 CFS for diversion to approximately 6,000 acres. Just so you're clear. So I'm going to offer this for your record if you
I have some questions on that.
Sure.
So that was kind of along the lines of what I was asking earlier. Could you help to put that in perspective as far as unimpaired flow?
Yes, basically what's occurring is that if now, CDFW is exactly right. There are microclimates that occur up there. You know, we have a cloud burst here and a thing here. But for the most part, I can leave it up to you, have your staff look at it. It's tracking pretty close to 77. So if that's occurred, if you go 50 CFS out of 85, you're roughly, 75% of the flow of the creek is going to be for fisheries. So that's the percentage ballpark. That doesn't include the pulse flow. So the pulse flow is 100%. Because it'd be 50 plus 50 or 100 CFS, which is ever more.
Okay, and when I asked that question earlier, could you get that chart up? Remember the chart where you were making the comparison? It was by month. So, Mr. O'Loughlin, what you're describing concerns me, but I can't tell if that's worst case scenario and if maybe there's a different way of looking at it. So that chart you pulled up earlier, well,
The exceedance plot. That
yeah,
was-
yeah. So this makes it look like it's not that big of an impact, that those flows would normally occur anyway. And I can't make sense out of the two different viewpoints here.
When we reviewed the 1977 flow records and did see some similarities, I think we're a little ahead of some of the flows are higher later in the year. Part of the regulation, the way we approached that was we didn't have any fish information to pair with that flow data. We have more relevant fish information to pair, passage information to pair with more recent data. But within the regulation itself, it was set up that if a situation occurred where those flows are really dropping at these levels, they're likely reaching temperatures that are going to be ending the end of the migration period anyhow. So by the time we hit June 10th, that is why looking at those flow levels, we anticipate that the adult migration will probably be over by then. And it would be juvenile flows that we would be comparing our exceedance or our occurrence to at that point.
So at what point would there be a 75% of unimpaired flow to fish versus 100? Or is there a different number that you'd be using?
As far as the base flow or the actual percent we didn't, I don't know if I'm going to be able to pull up all the actual flow versus unimpaired flow data looking from 77 specifically. We can do it over number of days over the record of the gauges that based on exceedance curves and that type of information if you would like.
It's basically, to answer the question, if you look at 77 through data from now until June 15th, it approximates somewhere between 50 to 80% of the flow, okay? So currently, earlier in the year, like in the next couple days or so, if you ever get this you adopt it, it would be at the lower end of that percentage. And then, of course, later in the summer, as the flows drop, it'd be a higher percentage. And then when you go to the 20 CFS after June 15th, the number drops again. It goes to, there's about 60 CFS in the creek, and it'd be about a 33% of the total amount of flow, ballpark.
Unless there's a pulse, and then it would be 100%?
Yes, and then a pulse would be 100%.
So I've got a range of 33% to 100%, but during most of the flow period, it would be between 50 to 80% of unimpaired flow. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
And
about ballpark, right?
I should add, especially with the juvenile pulse flow, again, the idea of that pulse flow is to send the pulse down to get the last remaining juveniles out of the system into the Sacramento River so we lift curtailments. It's kind of the last effort before we get the lower watershed disconnected from the Sacramento and strand those fish.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
And it's 24 to 48 hours would be the duration of that pulse flow.
Right. The intention isn't to keep those flows the whole time, right?
No, it is not.
Not the pulse flows. The pulse flows are 24 to 72 hours,
Right.
as set forth in the rules and regs. So 1 to 3 days.
Mm-hmm.
So, the other one is I'm going to offer is records from the Stanford Vina Dam current diversions. We have this in a graphic form, but you should actually look at the records. It shows that flows are actually previous to the last weekend when Deer Creek and Stanford Vina did a pulse flow. are currently already below 50 CFS below the dam. I'm going to move on to some comments, and I think there's some misstatements of fact and law here that just are need to be addressed in a systematic way. Board Member Doduck, you asked a very good question. You said if we enter into these agreements, you know, is that it? Or voluntary agreements, is that it? And the answer your staff gave was yes. Well, the real answer is no. And the reason the answer is no is because, well, it might be yes, but if you have these rules and regulations coming behind us, the 4 alternatives that we're going to be talking about tomorrow, not only will Deer Creek be curtailed now, but it will be curtailed under any future curtailment proceeding that you may initiate under alternatives 1 through 4. So not only are they going to get hit now, but they're going to get hit again. So just the answer is they don't get a hall pass. They only get a hall pass to that extent. Now, the other interesting thing about that statement is if, and this is a weird one, think about this. So let's say Deer Creek enters into an agreement, okay, and Stanford Vina doesn't. Well, what's happened then is we've flipped the water right priority system. So all of a sudden now, Deer Creek gets a get out of jail free card. We go to the top of the class as far as priority, and we're not impacted, whereas they may be impacted. So that causes me grave concern about how that's going to be implemented, especially with the other water rights in the system, because there is a diversion that has been talked about much right today between Deer Creek Irrigation District and Stanford Vine. It's the Cone-Kimball diversion that diverts water as well. So you need to keep that in mind when you're moving forward. I think the temperature...
Tim, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Because you're basically saying that reaching 100% or near 100% collaboration on a stream is goes against the water rights system for protecting these fish. I mean, because one entity chooses to collaborate and voluntarily do something, and another one chooses not to. I mean, that's what that's the problem that we're into with groundwater, with a whole lot of other areas.
Oh, I feel your pain.
And collaboration is preferred. And if you can't collaborate, what's the alternative?
Well, we would expect that you would issue curtailment notices pursuant to your authority to issue curtailment notices that you have currently. So if there is a shortage of water, you would issue curtailment notices. So, the real question that this comes down to, and this is a legal issue that your staff will brief you on. So the question really here is this: we have a makeup. We have SB 7X, okay, and it told you guys to do public trust proceedings, and it told you to look specifically at Deer Creek, okay, and that process is ongoing. Okay, there's been no determination, and it says in SB 7X, and we'll bore you with the details later, you know, in the authorizing legislation that water rights priorities would be followed, and we're going to make sure that we follow the rule of priority, and we're going to follow the El Dorado case, you know. Okay, so I'm not going to bore you to tears with that. But now what's happened is we're jumping to the front of the line and saying, okay, that's not going to happen, so we're going to establish, and it's unclear to me whether you're trying to do this under a waste and unreasonable use action, which you say in all your documents, but then your charts and graphs talk about public trust. So I don't know which one you're trying to do here. So it's very confusing. And all I would say as a practitioner is a public trust proceeding, which you were told to do under SB 7X, is entirely different than a waste and unreasonable use proceeding, which is entirely different than a water quality control plan proceeding. So the problem is NIPS and CDFW have authority under ESA. But their authority under ESA is very much different than your authority. So they're exactly right. If there's fish being taken under the definition of take, they could come in and shut a diversion down. In fact, I've unfortunately participated in 2 of those events on Anderson Cottonwood and GCID. So they have that authority. But them having that authority doesn't mean that you have that authority. And if you do have that authority, under what process can you effectuate that authority? And it's very important, I think, what you've been hearing from the speakers is what process are you going to pick to effectuate your authority is what it really comes down to. And so in regards to the comments, and I think, you know, as we move forward through this process, you're going to, I don't know what you're going to do, but to give you an idea, so, and I deal with your staff all the time. So, but what is the temperature requirement? They say that when temperatures get too high, we're going to cut things off. Well, I turn to the experts, and the experts say, we don't know what too high is. Well, as a water right diverter and as a state board member, how do you do that? And then the other thing is, so we'll move to another thing. So it says in there, and you can ask them this question, is it says in there that you're going to find out what fish are present. Okay, when fish are present. So let's differentiate. There's two types of species we're talking here, and it's very important to keep that in mind. One is adult spring run coming into the system. One is Omicus and fall run Chinook leaving the system. So how do you find adult spring run? Well, you can go and do snorkel surveys in the lower creek, but wonder if they're in, are they doing snorkel surveys in the Sacramento River? Or more likely than not, the fish are being tamed. How long are they going to do it? Are they going to do it daily, weekly? And how are they going to report it? How do we know when we get our water back and what amount? So, I mean, these are just, I'm sorry to bore you to tears with these very rudimentary things, but they're very important because that goes to the totality of the impact. So I'll give you another one. You're going to see a slideshow here in a little bit. Well, maybe not since I'm talking so much. So we think, and it'd be interesting to hear from them, at River Mile 3.5, there's a riffle. And it appears to be very problematic. We think, even at flows of 50 CFS, like you said earlier, Chairwoman Marcus, it's the belly scraping across the salmon. So we've proposed that we go out. It's about a 20-foot, 25-foot riffle. Take a backhoe and just cut an incision down so that at 50 CFS or lower, those fish could move up. Now we're waiting to hear back, and I realize there's concerns because we have Omicus in the river, we have spring run, it's everything. But it's a drought. I mean, we got to do things maybe a little bit differently than we haven't done before. So what I'm trying to get at is, when you get done with what you're looking at, under one scenario, I could see that the impacts to Deer Creek Irrigation District might not be that significant. But then if I look at the other side of the equation, not knowing how these things, so your staff said by June 1st, we expect spring run to be out of the creek. Well, if 50 CFS base flow goes away on June 1st, well, my client's a happy camper. We think that's more than doable, okay? And we could effectuate doing the other flows until June 15th. But if it's till June 15th that there's 50 CFS and we're only going to get 10 CFS every day, and my clients need 14 CFS to get by on, we're not going to make it. I mean, so that's how precarious, this is how far apart we are on deciding what we can and can't do. And we've been talking to NIMS, we've been talking to CF, they've been very helpful, we've had a good exchange of ideas. We got the fish ladder installed, we did a pulse flow, they said they wanted 2 pulse flows before June 1st, we gave them one this weekend. Unfortunately, our timing was off, we should have probably waited a day to try to catch the backside of the storm. Okay, so, and we might even be able to do a pulse flow the first part of June. But the problem here is with the base flows being so high over an extended period of time, there's not going to be enough water for ag. There's just not.
So I have a question on this. Are you saying, I mean, you're making an appeal, which is basically this has an unreasonable impact on ag, but can you tie that together into an analysis on waste and unreasonable use? Because I've heard so many attorneys today say it has to be fact-based. You have to look at the circumstances. How do you do that? We do have regulatory authority for, an emergency reg to go in here. How do we do that in a reg? Looking at the specific circumstances, do you just look at like regions or stretch of the creek? And how it would impact diverters there? Help us.
Okay, well, I'm going to try to help. And actually, come on, I'm going to try to help, Tim. I saw that.
I'm listening to you, Tim. I'm listening to you.
And that's the conundrum. I mean, I think NIMS and CDFW recognize it, and we recognize it. So the question that you're asking is, that's why I asked the questions earlier. So if you're extirpating fish, if you were going to wipe out the fish species in Deer Creek, I'm going to say this, my client would probably shoot me. There'd be no doubt, take as much water as you need, you can't extirpate the fish. Okay, that's an easy one. So the hard part for you right now is you have 700 fish that have gone up. Okay, you have spring run on these other creeks. You have 30 days maybe, you know, that we're trying to look at getting through, and you got upwards to 100 fish. And I'm not saying that's the number. I don't know if it's 30, 100, 150. And how do you balance that against the competing water demand at Deer Creek? Because one of the interesting things about your order is, or your staff's draft, is that there's no determination of waste and unreasonable use at either Deer Creek or Stanford Vina. In fact, there's nothing in the record about what Deer Creek grows, and actually I have a document I'd like to put into the record, what they grow, how they use water, how much water they use. There's nothing in the record regarding Stanford Vina. So there's no finding that those districts are, in the classic sense, wasting water. So the way the hook is being set, so to speak, on this case, is that the waste is the finding that 50 CFS is needed for, I'm going to use shorthand, public trust, okay, for fish and wildlife purposes, okay? And so that's the hook. So the interesting part about this is that once you've made a determination that there is a waste and unreasonable use of water, in my opinion, as a water right attorney, there is no ability to use water, because that would be illegal. So the funny part about this is that the determination's being made in a creek for another use, and I think Tony Francois talked about this. So what you're saying is we prefer this beneficial use for fish more than this beneficial use for ag, but you have nothing in the record regarding ag, and I got to tell you, the record's pretty sparse regarding fish. I don't disagree with them. I've been through this. Actually, I drafted the 2007 agreement. I drafted the water exchange agreement on Deer Creek. So that's the conundrum we face. And I think what we should do, this is me personally, I think what we need to do is look at alternatives. So do we keep minimum flows at 20 CFS, see where fish are holding, and maybe do pulse flows and move fish up, because then we don't have to worry about this riffle? Do we go in and fix this riffle at river mile 3.5 and see if we can move fish at 50 CFS or lower and then do pulse flows? I mean, we got to be, water's scarce, we all understand that. So how is it, because if these numbers stay and it's the bad end of the thing, every farmer in Deer Creek will be wiped out. They just don't have the well capacity to make this up. Your staff report's not off by much. It's about 10 to 20%. And by the time June is over, there will be no Deer Creek. And I'll just tell you, my guys are small family farmers. These are not the Boswells. These are not the guys I normally represent with thousands and thousands of acres. These are family farm people. Most of my people in Deer Creek, in fact, almost all of them that I know, have jobs. And they come home and they work on their family farms that they have forever. So their profit margins and their operating margins are like this. And that's the problem we face. And that's the problem you face. I don't envy your position. It's very hard in a drought trying to balance these competing interests that you have to do. And all I'm saying is right now, as drafted, as proposed, this rule or reg isn't where you want to go. And I'll quit there. I've taken way too much of your time. I do have a couple documents, if I could, if the chair would allow me. I don't need to bore you with detail, chair or the, sorry, vice chair. I know.
We're a team.
That's
I'd like to put into the record late this afternoon or tomorrow in electronic form. I have some numbers on cropping patterns in Deer Creek, water use in Deer Creek, ETs, evaporations, demand. So you have that, and you know what that would be, and we did an economic impact analysis as well. And do you want to see some pictures of Deer Creek so you can kind of figure? I have our biologists here. We've looked at it, and I think it'd be helpful to kind of show the creek. And you guys can talk too if you want. I mean, about what it looks like.
Well, I'm curious. You mentioned that there was a difference between 10 and 14 CFS that makes a critical difference, but my understanding is that some of the well capacity could make up that difference. and make that,
Especially.
and reach to that 14 CFS, and wouldn't that help?
Yes, there's no doubt that you could look at some ability to pump groundwater, but the problem is, so just a simple mathematical equation is this, okay? And I think Tom will verify this. In California, and I took this out of DWR's report, Zone 14, the demand is roughly 10 GPM, 10 gallons per minute per acre, okay, is what's required to keep a crop in good condition. Now,
Crop, yeah.
now think about this. We all know that it's not 10 gallons isn't applied every minute, but
Right.
over time, so the gross number in Deer Creek right now is 6.6 inches in May and 7 inches in June, and that's to the plant. So you need roughly you need about 11 inches, call it 12. That's for the plant alone. That's perfect 100% efficiency, no irrigation losses, no nothing. According to DWR, that's what's required during this zone of curtailment. So if you do the mathematics on this, if you have 1,900 acres, you roughly need 19,000 gallons per minute. If you go to 10 CFS delivered into the Deer Creek, you will have 4,500 gallons per minute. So we're short almost 15,000 gallons per minute per day. So effectually what happens in that situation, you're correct, we could pick up a well here or a well there, but overall the demand is the demand in the area, given the temperatures and the cropping patterns, not including any losses in efficiency because we don't operate at 100% efficiency, you will have, every crop will not meet its demand and will be dead by the end of June. And so just do the math. I mean, you're 19,000, you only get 45, you're 15,000 gallons per minute short. So I'm going to put that into the record for you as well. If you would,
And does that include the DWR well? Did that information?
but so let's look at it. So DWR, we did a pilot exchange program, Deer Creek did, and DWR drilled a well. Unfortunately, that well only has 1,000 GPM capacity. So 1,000 GPM is not going to make up the difference between 19 and 45. And the problem with the well, no offense against DWR, it was an experiment, we did it for a certain reason, it's drilled so deep, it costs, it was $13,000, I think I quoted you folks, $13,000 just to pump 330 acre feet. That's a lot of money. So those are some of the issues. If you, so if I have the board's consent, I'd file those documents later this afternoon for the record, and then we don't have to go through them. And why don't we just show a quick couple slides, if we could, of Deer Creek.
Can I just get some clarification, Mr. O'Loughlin,
Sure.
as to, you know, I've seen 2 piles of documents that you've referenced putting into the record, and obviously we've indicated it's not an evidentiary proceeding, and you know, the board is going to be generally accepting. We recognize the short timelines people are operating under. But these other materials you're referring to electronically that are going to be submitted, are those something that are available now, or?
Oh yeah, like as soon as I leave, I'm going to put them on. I'll electronically submit them.
Okay.
I will not.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Well, I'm just concerned, you know, obviously the board is going to be deliberating on this item, but in terms of when they're actually going to be available, so there's some clarity as to when the record actually is closing. So.
Well, that's an interesting one. So when would you like to, I mean, when they decide the record's closed, so that's my problem.
Yes, well, that's why I'm trying to
That's
determine
the
when you're going
point.
to be providing these to us.
Well, and
There's Wi-Fi.
And I don't know where my fellow board members are on this, but I would just say, I know that there have been discussions on Deer Creek. So anything that can be done to reach an agreement would be preferable. I mean, you heard what I said earlier. I personally think as long as there are agreements, I don't see that there's an urgent need to move forward with the regulation. I don't know that anyone else agrees with me on that. But what do you guys need to do to reach agreement on deer? What can be done?
Well, if I misspeak or you don't want to talk about this, this is fine with me. So it's up to you. I'll remain mum if you want me to just say we're talking.
Can you
Oh,
talk?
so you are talking.
Oh, no,
wasn't
we
clear
talked
from
every
the
day
opening
for the
remarks.
Well, no, I know
But
they've
then
been
you
talking.
stopped talking and started preparing for this hearing.
Well, unfortunately, we have to
That's
do
what we
that
found
too.
out you were doing yesterday.
Right, but I guess, can we have a parallel path? You're fighting, but in the meantime, can you take off that hat and then sit down and talk outside? And,
Well, the
I heard you guys are pretty close, so it'd be great if you could
problem
reach
was-
agreement.
Well, the problem was today. So unfortunately, we had to prepare for today,
Yeah.
which ate up most of yesterday and today.
Sure.
And then unfortunately, for you, you have me here again tomorrow, probably just for 5 minutes though, hopefully. So
Give
I
you
know.
10.
Yeah, it eats up time. I mean, we're closer than when we started. And we've hopefully solved some of the issues. We've done some of the things that they've wanted. But there's the problem is, from my perspective, is the longevity of the base flow and the amount. It can't be made up in the long run. That's it. So we'll work on it. I'm not opposed. I mean, I'm schizophrenic, so I can wear several hats at several times. So it's not a problem. And try to see if we can work through those issues.
Well, again, this is just one board member speaking, but anything you can do to close that gap tonight,
Yeah,
it would make a difference
We've been
for
coming
me.
together, and I think on the base flow element, I think we have some good discussion points to work through.
Would it be helpful to have Paul Manassian speak and then show the slides?
Why don't we show these slides real quick?
Okay.
They're pretty interesting.
The pictures would be nice right now.
Pictures are nice. They're
Yeah.
worth 1,000 words. And you
It
have to
works
look
for
at
me.
Riffle, and it'd be interesting to hear from DFW and know if they agree with our concurrence that Riffle at River Mile 3.5 is really a problem. So go ahead,
Yeah.
pop it up.
I'll be quick. And it breaks things up, too.
Which
That's
one
nice.
do you
Yeah.
want to do? The first one?
Yeah, let's do the first one.
The first one? Yeah, the base flow one.
Let's
That'd
see.
be perfect. Yeah. Thank you very much
Yeah,
for your
appreciate
No, thank you.
directions and indulgence. I do appreciate it.
Thank you. That got much better. Sorry to be sharp.
All right.
She might not be sorry to be
I
sharp,
will
but I'm.
concede, you made a couple of good points.
We're all trying to do our job.
No, that was helpful. Thank you.
Just go through the slides.
Yeah, we'll go quick. My name's Gabriel Kopp. I'm a senior fisheries biologist with Fish Bio. I have 15 years experience working along the West Coast and in California. I got a call Friday night that it would be good to have some pictures of Deer Creek, and Saturday morning, May 17th, we went out and conducted the survey. The actual presentation was prepared on May 18th. That's the date you see above. Basically, on May 17th, we did a quick walk survey, basically through the stream. It was a wet wade and walk survey, and we were looking at just general conditions. So I'll just jump right into it for the sake of time. Here we go. Oh, there we go. This was the surveyed area that we were able to perform under short notice. The yellow area from below the Highway 99 bridge up to the Stanford-Vina Dam. The red area was just not permissible due to landowner access permission at the time. The flow at the time was 48 CFS. You can see it's on the descending limb of the hydrograph there. The temperature was upwards of the mid-70s, so it was a little bit warmer. We basically assessed whether or not there was salmonid holding habitat. We did find that there were several pools at 6 feet or greater, which at the flow of 48 CFS was, a positive that we found. Through the course of our walk, we did not find any adult or juvenile salmon. It's difficult to identify juvenile salmon during a walk and a wade, but the adults are fairly reasonable to see. Here's water depth starting near River Mile 2.3, so this is below the Highway 99 bridge, just above the trestle bridge where the railroad tracks cross, a couple miles upstream of the confluence. You can see that there's a deep water holding habitat. This pool in particular was 8 to 10 feet in depth. This is getting into some of the shallower riffles. Below the Highway 99 bridge, we generally averaged at 1 foot or greater. This was a slightly thinner riffle, but had pockets that were at a 1/2 foot or greater. Moving upstream, this is just above the bridge. This is where we began to look at riffles and see just what kind of minimum depths we were seeing. Would these be generally passable? And I'll kind of flip through a few, but you'll notice that all of them are within the range of about a half-foot minimum depth. So that's still considered reasonable for fish passage for an adult salmon based upon my professional opinion and past experience. Moving up, this is above the Highway 99 bridge near River Mile 3. You can again see, it's hard to see with the picture in the frame, but we were getting pools with max depths up to 7 feet. So even at this low flow, there was still some reasonable holding habitat for temporary periods. Again, additional riffles, just kind of flipping through. This riffle in particular was still maintaining a minimum depth of a half foot in some areas, not all the way across, but in some. This is actually the riffle that we were talking about, the riffle at River Mile 3.5. And this is where, when I walked up on the riffle, I had some concern about it being at a minimum passage impediment. I know I've seen salmon, especially in the Northwest, ascend some fairly shallow riffles, and they can surprise you. Their resolve is pretty amazing. But this riffle in particular looked fairly thin at the existing conditions, and much lower than that, I would say with certainty that it would be a significant passage impediment. The positive side of this was that it was not a very big riffle. It was in reasonable access, and I would postulate with a little bit of a cavalier attitude and a pick and a shovel, I could probably take care of it in a couple hours. Of course, I wouldn't do that, but it was not a significant revision that could be made. And this is the area that we were speaking of that would help allow for a lower base flow and still have access up through the stream, in my opinion. As you move further up, we don't see the riffles continuing to get thinner. In fact, we were seeing a little bit greater depth above the riffle at River Mile 3.5, and we were finding that they were reasonably passable. Here's another one at 4.0. 4.1, you can see the nice cut on the far side of the stream. And here's Stanford Vina Dam, the end of our walking survey at River Mile 4.5. It seemed as though that there was somewhere between 7 to 8 feet of depth below the dam immediately. We did not see any fish at that time, and when we spoke with the landowner, the last adult that he had seen was somewhere along the course of 2 to 3 weeks ago. And there was a higher flow based upon that. What we did find from the walking survey that we did was that, albeit at a lower flow, and there was shallower riffle habitat to get through, we found that all of the riffles were reasonably passable that we surveyed, except for the one at River Mile 3.5, which was questionable. It's not to say that it was a barrier, but it was questionable. I don't know if it makes sense to go through the smoke survey. Yeah, that's good. Good? Okay.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Paul Manassian. I represent the Stanford Vina Mutual Water Company. And I'm going to presume that you haven't had a chance to review our presentation or the draft declaration that we provided to you. I apologize. I was unable to get the declaration signed before it was submitted to you. But basically a summary of what the declaration will contain, if you will allow us to present it, and what we would provide at a brief evidentiary hearing, if you would conduct it, would be that this is the Deer Creek flows used by Stanford Vina are basically 65% of the total flow. Mm-hmm. The Stanford Vina lands consist of orchard, pasture, and a town of Vina, and that the groundwater and the surface water are in balance at this point. Now, if you take away 50 to 60% of the water, for a period of 1 month to 2 months in the case of a dry year, what happens is you throw that balance totally out of whack. The landowners do not have sufficient well capacity to pump to maintain their crops. So the time to anticipate this emergency was months ago. And if you think about the fish agencies studying the problems of the fish, doubling the fish, think about all the money that has been spent in regard to fisheries. And to now say there's an emergency, we have to dry up this farmland. Now, how many acres is it? It's 4,500 irrigated acres. We estimate that approximately half of it will be lost as a result of a constraint like this. Now, we are getting to the point where we're close to June. So if normally this constraint was in place for the full months of May and June, we would lose half. We think we'll lose about a third of the irrigated acres. And that includes prunes, some walnuts and almonds will be stressed, pasture for breeding operations, and fortunately the landowners prepared for a drought. They know what happens in 76, 77. What we aren't prepared for is you. And so because you may not read those points and authorities, don't sacrifice the credibility of the board in this particular way. You're having trouble understanding why these agreements aren't entered into by Stanford Vina and Deer Creek. Why not? I mean, aren't we cooperative? We put a pulse flow down. We've been maintaining 50 CFS, but we can't do it any longer. That's the point. And when we ask for the reasonable things that people normally do when the agencies have not built a fish hatchery for spring run, the normal things we do is we go out with a backhoe and a dozer and we make a low flow channel. Why do we do that? Because it doesn't take 50 CFS to maintain, and it keeps the water cooler. Now, we have been asking for their permission or asking them to do it for years. We used to do it ourselves. Now we're under threat of violation. So there's a problem here. And honestly, the problem is they think you're going to save them from their failure to prepare for this by adopting this emergency regulation. And if you will please get out of the way and say you won't do that, this problem will get solved. Second point I want to make to you. When you have a vital interest in fishery, you have a vital interest in farming and agriculture, why would you even entertain a regulation that infers that agriculture is wasteful or unreasonable when, quote, the fish may need it? And why would you go through a procedure in which you accept a couple of pieces of paper with people's estimates and wish lists of what they want in flow and refuse an evidentiary hearing? Now, how does that give your board any credibility at all? Well, I know you're in a hurry. I know it's an emergency. And I know that you don't want to act punitively towards the fishery agencies or landowners, but they've put you on a track. You're going down the track of taking, of inverse condemnation. There are adjudications on these creeks. There are courts that have determined things. You have not gone to those courts and said, may we have a standard here for minimum flows? If you went to the courts and asked the courts for authority to hold a brief hearing, come back to the courts and appoint a fish watermaster, I'll bet you Tehama County Superior Court would do it. These people do not hate fish. And if you do those sort of things, there is time to try to adjust. Now, I got 100 families in Vina that if this groundwater, it won't happen all at one time, they're poor people, generally, farm workers. If you implement this order, you are on a path for 270 days. Nothing saying you won't continue it, but how do you decide it's reasonable at the end of 270 to all of a sudden not order 50 CFS base flow and 300 CFS pulse flows? So, look, please read the material. If you want to be in charge of relocation assistance, it's a governmental code requirement for those 100 families in the town of Vina. If you want me to have to bring a condemnation action against you and seek millions of dollars and attorney's fees, I don't want to do it. And it's a very bad precedent. And if you're talking about public trust, hey, this is not the place to assert it. Deer Creek is Mexican land grant ground, and under SUMA versus California, United States Supreme Court says public trust doesn't apply there. I don't know if it does or not. But why do we have to remake the world in regard to 6,000 acres of farmland of middle-class families? And the answer is we don't. Now, a moment ago, we talked about, well, these agreements, maybe they're the solution. Let me suggest to you that if you will get out of the way, you will not be joining an effort, which is very similar to, it's a rainy night, we're in a car, and NIMS and California Department of Fish and Game come up to the window and they rap with their gun and say, I need your car. Now, that's not a good way to start. And actually, they've been very polite. They've indicated that it is a real emergency, and we have no doubt about that. That's why we're trying to cooperate. But you don't want to be associated with that sort of threat. Let me read to you a sentence out of the NIMS agreement. It says, NIMS is thus seeking to encourage participation in the drought initiative, and to that end will, in making decisions about bringing or referring enforcement actions, consider participation in the drought initiative an important mitigating factor. Now, do you want to really adopt a regulation that enforces that sort of threat? And I don't know that they meant it. I think that they really were concerned about the fish, and Mill Creek was really concerned about the fish, but they authorized us to send you a letter indicating that although they signed this document, they felt real threat. They could not afford to go into a fight mode. Well, we all can't afford to go into a fight mode, and you can solve that problem. Just refuse to adopt these regulations and leave us to get our backhoes, our dozers, and our less than 50 CFS in really bad circumstances, and we'll get another pulse flow, and we'll do the best we can. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all the cards that I have. There's a lot here. There's more coming in apparently tonight. Are there questions, any additional questions that you would like to ask, particularly ask staff, because that's...
I do have one. Yeah. Continuing jurisdiction of the court on the adjudication. Could staff comment on that? It's been brought up several times that I know there are a number of different alternatives. You know, there's the Fish and Game Code, there's ESA, so I think I understand how those would work, but I don't understand how would this work and how quickly could that tool be used effectively?
I don't think that we could adequately say how quickly that tool could be used. Certainly, we have the adjudication and are aware of it and have looked at it, and considered the fact, certainly adjudications go into how we would implement this if the reg were adopted by the board, because that affects the order of priority and seniority. So we definitely looked at it. I'm not sure that we can answer the question of whether that could have addressed the issue more quickly than an emergency regulation. And time was of the essence, which is why this is an emergency regulation. I mean, we've talked about this. This is certainly in all the documents. So I really can't say. Certainly, it would not have applied to all three of the creeks because not all three are under adjudications, and would have had to been dealt with separately even if they were.
Does it apply to deer?
The
I can't remember. Is deer under adjudication?
I'm
Yes.
not aware.
Yes.
Staff can tell me if
Okay.
there's a Deer Creek there. I'm aware of the Mill Creek adjudication.
Deer, Mill Creek are both under adjudications to Hayman County Superior Court. I can give you the street address.
So I wasn't speaking for all of staff what I'm aware of. I know that Dan has certainly looked into that very thoroughly, and I would just have the mill adjudication because that was brought up in one of the comment letters, because we went through all of the comment letters very thoroughly and looked at each of these points. So maybe someone else has additional information if you need it.
Okay.
Tam, do you have any questions?
I don't have questions, but I have a suggestion.
Okay.
We've obviously heard a lot today, and Mr. O'Loughlin in particular had my head spinning. I understand there's more documents coming, and I would like another chance to go through the documents that I do have. So I'm suggesting that we convene for the day and revisit this item first thing in the morning.
Is there anything you'd like for staff to do over the evening?
No, but I would like to meet with staff first thing in the morning. You probably need to schedule time with all of us.
Right. Madam Chair, do you have any additions you would like to add to that?
No, if I'm trying to listen very carefully and I want to reread sort of everything and chart out, I have a lot of questions. I don't want to keep people really long tonight, but I do have some questions. I have one I wanted to ask now, which may seem obvious, and it's related to something that Mr. O'Loughlin said. It had been on my question list anyway. We're talking about curtailments and dealing with the fish flows here. Absent that, how are we anticipating curtailments would apply? Would they be, in the normal course, we be curtailing these streams in the exact same period of time? And so would you have an overlapping curtailment of the seniority, traditional seniority kind?
Are you asking that, say, because I think it was raised a question, what if we're doing the delta curtailments or something like that? Would it play in?
Any kind of, of the options we have, all four.
This gets complicated fast in that here, of course, since we're putting in a base flow specifically in these tributaries for the fish passage, and as we see from the hydrology, it digs quite deep, and it's looking at post-14, pre-14 riparian. It's looking at all the water rights. What's on the agenda for tomorrow is just looking at the post-14, so it wouldn't, by necessity, not dig as deep into those. But you're correct in that if we actually had just a water availability issue to protect senior water rights, then there would be potential for curtailment in these watersheds. But I think what I've been hearing is that, well, those rights seem to be generally satisfied. It's because we need that bottom, if you will, for the fish protection flows, that it brings us up sooner and it cuts more deeply. So arguably, I guess short answer is that for any other curtailments, and I think we'd want to take care of it to not just say, well, just because there's an agreement means that you're not touched. If you're a junior water right holder, a post-14 water right holder, and you're part of that agreement, you could be affected by other curtailments, say, in the Delta watershed.
Okay.
And this is why, it's problematic to give an absolute yes or no for these things. We have to look at it and put it in the context fairly with everything else that would be done and coming out.
I'm just thinking about it from the perspective of the folks who are in these creeks and trying for intelligibility, not only of what we're doing now, but what's to come, and for us to be able to think about, to the extent we're dealing with a judgment call, what that judgment call ought to be. So I'm just trying to digest all that from the perspective of somebody on one of these creeks.
Sure, but correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, but a lot of these are very senior water rights, pre-14 and riparian for a block of, the water rights. So there would be relative certainty there that these would be, could be carved out with regard to some larger curtailments. But again, that's something we would have to look into, and this speaks to the overarching question here appears to be, is there trust with what the water board would do with this if we have the emergency reg? We're not going to take this new tool and go out and be crazy and use it and now say, well, now we can and therefore we will. There are off-ramps for every element of the curtailment. If we have information that suggests temperatures are not right, things are not right, we don't just blindly require basefall flows through June. Information appears to suggest now that that would not be a wise thing to do, and therefore